Hey everyone, and welcome. Today we're diving into a landmark court case that you've probably never heard of, but trust me, it completely changed our idea of what a fair justice system should look like. This is the incredible story of the Osborn precedent.
Okay, let me ask you something. Imagine you've spent years training for, say, a huge singing competition. You send in your application, you practice like crazy, but on the day of the final, the judges just say, you know what? No need to actually sing for us. We'll just decide based on your paperwork. How would that feel? Pretty unfair, right? Of course it would. Well, that exact feeling, that sense of being judged without ever being heard, is at the absolute heart of this case.
And this brings us to a really important legal idea called procedural fairness. It sounds complicated, but it's actually a simple, powerful concept. It means that justice isn't just about getting the right result in the end. It's about the journey to get there being fair for everyone involved. For centuries, it's been a basic belief in common law that how a decision is made is just as important as what that decision is. So, where did this whole question of fairness really come to a boil? It all happened with the Parole Board, which is an organization that holds an absolutely immense power. The power to decide if a prisoner can be released and get their freedom back. You see, before this case, the way things were usually done was that these huge, life-altering decisions were made on the papers. A panel would just look through a prisoner's file, reports, assessments, their history, and then decide their fate. A lot of the time, they would do this without ever meeting or even speaking to the person whose entire future they were holding in their hands. And this, right here, perfectly sets up the central conflict. On one side, you had the Parole Board, which was arguing for efficiency. Look, doing it on paper is just faster and cheaper. But on the other side, you have the prisoner, whose literal freedom is on the line, arguing for a basic right to be heard, to explain themselves, and to challenge the evidence that's being used against them. This tension was the perfect setup for a classic David and Goliath legal battle. It was three individuals taking on the entire established system.
So at the center of all this were three men: Mr. Osborn, Mr. Booth, and Mr. Riley. Their specific situations were a bit different. Mr. Osborn and Mr. Riley had actually been released but then recalled back to prison. Mr. Booth had served his minimum term. But they all had two things in common. First, they'd been denied parole based on paperwork alone. And second, their request to just make their case in person, to have what's called an oral hearing, was denied. Their demand was so simple: just let us be heard.
Now, their fight was not easy. They didn't just ask once and give up. After getting turned down, they appealed. They kept pushing their case up the entire legal ladder, fighting all the way to the highest court in the land, the UK Supreme Court. And this is where the story reaches its climax. The Supreme Court now had to answer this fundamental question: when does fairness absolutely demand that a person gets to be heard? Their decision was going to change everything. So, after hearing all the arguments from both sides, the 7 justices of the Supreme Court came back with their judgment. And wow, it was powerful, it was clear, and it was completely unanimous. Lord Reed, who delivered the judgment, just laid it out so plainly. He said the Parole Board doesn't just have the option to be fair, it has a duty to be fair. And that duty means they have to grant an oral hearing whenever fairness calls for it. And with that one sentence, the entire game was flipped on its head. So what does whenever fairness requires it actually mean in the real world? Well, the court gave some really clear guidelines. A hearing is probably needed if there are important facts that are being argued about, or if evidence needs to be properly tested, or even if just getting a face-to-face impression of the person could make a real difference. And this next part is so important. The court also said it matters that the prisoner feels like they've had a fair shot. And from now on, if the board denies a hearing, they have to explain exactly why. This ruling, which we now know as the Osborn Precedent, didn't just impact those 3 men. It kicked off a brand new era of fairness for parole hearings right across the country. I mean, the change in practice was just massive. Think about it. Before Osborn, getting an oral hearing was a rare exception. The prisoner had to prove why they deserved one. After Osborn, it basically became the default. Now, the parole board has to prove why a hearing isn't needed. The whole thing went from a closed-door process to one that's way more open and participatory. So here's the bottom line. Thanks to the incredible perseverance of Osborn, Booth, and Riley, this simple, intuitive idea that a person should be able to speak for themselves when their own freedom is on the line is now a protected cornerstone of our justice system. And that really leaves us with one final thought to chew on. This case was about parole, sure, but the principle behind it is universal, right? It applies to any situation where a powerful body, whether it's a government agency, your employer, even a school, is making a decision that's going to have a huge impact on your life. So the question is, shouldn't you always have the right to be heard? The Osborn case argues, loud and clear, absolutely yes.